All right. Okay, so today we are going to cover part two of our lecture on the last 10,000 years, the origins of agriculture and the Anthropocene. So we had already covered essentially the positive and negative consequences of the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. We covered some of the evidence of how this process happened, whether it was agriculture coming first and then large population size coming later, or whether it was the reverse, or whether it was a little bit of both. We talked about some of the consequences of this transition, and now we're going to talk about some additional consequences. So environmental degradation is well documented and began around 10,000 years before present. So there does appear to be a correlation between the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and this gradual decline of the planet. We know that the process of domesticating and raising plants and animals will overall reduce world biodiversity, and it has done so for several reasons, because we need to in order to successfully engage in agriculture and animal husbandry, especially in modern day, we have to essentially tear down a lot of the natural habitat. There's a lot of deforestation happening to provide areas for agriculture and animal husbandry. Also, a lot of the animals that we have domesticated for food purposes essentially release methane into our atmosphere. They also trample the land and degrade the soil. Also, since we focus in on certain characteristics of these domesticated animals, we have reduced their biodiversity because we are selecting the genes and the traits that we want that are beneficial for us for producing food and for making sure that they're easily domesticated. So trying to breed out those traits that make them more aggressive, trying to breed out those traits that make them require too much from us while we're raising them, essentially. So essentially we have impacted their biodiversity through the very process of domestication. Unchecked population growth could lead to a food crisis. I think I should update this slide. I think it absolutely has led to a food crisis. Even in the developed world, there are unfortunately plenty of people that don't have enough food to eat. So, you could definitely argue that population size has certainly exceeded the carrying capacity. There are many people on this planet that go hungry. So, we have entered into a situation where we don't necessarily have the proper resources, or at least we're not utilizing our resources properly to make sure that everyone is fed. All right, so cultural and technological changes have also had some negative impacts on our planet. Burning fossil fuels is cited as one of the main reasons for global climate change over the last 10,000 years, but more specifically over the last 200 to 300 years as we transitioned into the Industrial Revolution, and we rely pretty heavily on the burning of fossil fuels for transportation, for communication, for industry. And I definitely need to update this PowerPoint slide. I thought I did last semester. Population has increased from 2 million to over 8 billion. The population is about 8.5 billion people right now. So we have certainly seen a population explosion over the last 10,000 years. And, like we mentioned last lecture, it's not necessarily a problem for population size to grow, as long as we have the resources, as long as we can utilize the resources around us to feed the population size. But the reason it becomes a problem is when it exceeds the carrying capacity and also strains the global environment and creates a situation where we're greatly impacting our planet and trying to exploit as many resources as we can to feed the people around us. But we definitely created quite a strain on the environment around us. So it's something that we have to consider deeply. Some countries, of course, have put limitations on how many offspring a person or a couple can have, or there's of course arguments both ways on that, but it's definitely something to consider. as we think about population growth and how it impacts our environment. Definitely something to think about. Because I think the population growth is definitely a problem that we all, unfortunately, will have to deal with in the near future. Biological changes that we're seeing, we talked about the last 6 million years of evolution, but we have definitely seen some biological craniofacial changes that have happened just over the last 10,000. And it's believed to be at least partially due to this transition to a softer diet. So essentially, when we're practicing agriculture, we're eating a lot of carbohydrates, and we're also, of course, using tool technologies and using fire to process our food prior to consumption. So a lot of these recent changes can be linked to the agricultural and the industrial revolution. We know that, studying past fossil hominins, we've learned that something as simple as the diets that they consume can actually influence their physical appearance, especially when we're talking craniofacial appearance. So, thinking way back to the Australopithecines, we saw really marked differences between the gracile and the robust forms based simply on their diet. The gracile forms were consuming a more generalized, softer diet, whereas the robust forms were consuming a lot of vegetation, tubers, rough, tough items that required a lot of chewing force. So just their diet made their craniofacial shape very different. The robust forms had, the flaring zygomatic bones, the extreme postorbital constriction, the sagittal crest, the massive molars, whereas the gracile forms had, kind of the opposite of those features. They still had some postorbital constriction and zygomatic flare, but you don't see the sagittal crest, you don't see the massive molars. So even if you're just looking at gracile versus robust Australopithecines, you can see that most of their differences, their craniofacial differences, are related to their diet. So that's definitely something you can also comparably see if you're looking at early Homo sapiens versus later Homo sapiens. The Homo sapiens that are more recent or have even more gracile, delicate features. They tend to have smaller dentition, they have smaller jaws, they have more vertical faces, they have taller crania, whereas some of the earlier Homo sapiens have some more robust features. They have thicker brow ridges, they have slightly larger jaws, but it's definitely something that is believed to be influenced by dietary differences. Crowded jaws are one of the main problems that modern humans face today. Most of us have had our wisdom teeth removed. So we've had that third molar removed because our jaws are getting smaller at a faster rate than our teeth are. So our jaws are getting crowded. So essentially, these crowded jaws are caused by these evolutionary changes happening quickly. Also, modern day dentistry, modern day dentistry sometimes is focused on making the teeth look appealing. We've decided what looks appealing to us. We've decided, that the maxillary teeth, the upper teeth, should be slightly slightly in front of the mandibular teeth. We've decided that, of course, teeth should be straight and whitish in color. When I say we, I mean the collective society as a whole has decided, things that are considered attractive for dentition. Whereas in reality, that's not necessarily what is needed for functioning dentition. Functioning dentition are not necessarily pearly white. The jaws are in line rather than the maxillary teeth being in front of the mandibular. So these are just things to keep in mind, that just because we focus on certain things in dentistry doesn't necessarily mean that that's biologically what our teeth are supposed to look like. All right, humanity's changing face. Our face and jaw size becomes smaller than those of our early hominid ancestors. So the two hypotheses, early explanations focused in on racial typology and differences. Obviously, we know from numerous examples throughout this course that that's not valid. Homo sapiens are 99.9% identical. There is no differences that we can explain through racial typology. So the one that's supported is the masticatory functional hypothesis, stating that changes in skull form are a response to decreased demands on the chewing muscles. So just that simple fact that we are consuming food that is softer We are consuming food that has been processed with tools, with fire, et cetera, before we even start to chew on it. So, our diet is simply softer than our ancestors was. And because of that, over time, it selected for smaller jaws, smaller teeth, more gracile facial features. And it's kind of fascinating to me that all of these changes that, have become pretty distinct and pretty dramatic over the last 10,000 years, it's all essentially due to diet, which is very fascinating to me. All right, so masticatory functional hypothesis, just to review, it's the hypothesis that craniofacial, so the crania is what holds the brain basically, and then the facial obviously is the facial. So the skull, essentially, the craniofacial shape change during the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, was related to the consumption of softer food items, which seems relatively simple, but it is the most likely hypothesis. All right, oops, uh-oh, what did I do there? Getting used to a new computer here. All right, so let me get back to where I was. Not sure what I did there. Okay, malocclusions. So the malocclusion is just an overbite or an underbite. So actually how our teeth are supposed to be, they're supposed to be perfectly in line with one another. So a malocclusion and overbite occurs when the maxillary teeth, remember the maxilla, that's the upper jaw here, that's the maxilla, this is the mandible. So an overbite occurs when the maxillary teeth extend farther forward than the mandibular teeth, so the upper teeth above the lower teeth. And an underbite is just simply the opposite. An underbite occurs when the mandibular teeth extend farther forward than the maxillary teeth. So these are the results of crowded jaws. Essentially the jaws becoming the jaws reducing in size more quickly than the teeth are. So in modern day, of course, we can have a dentist remove our last molar to reduce that stress. So we have a dentist remove those last molars. But when we're talking about before modern day dentistry, as this is happening to our ancestors, they simply just had to deal with it. They couldn't have that molar removed. All right, changes in workload and activity also affected the postcranial skeleton, so from the neck down. So as we've learned before, thinking way back to the human adaptation chapters when we learned about Wolff's law, that bone essentially is created where it's needed. So the more you use your body, the more osteocytes are produced. So your bones are going to respond to stresses. So essentially the more active you are, the thicker, the more robust your bone morphology. So that's why anybody that's ever broken a bone, at some point in your healing, I imagine that your doctor suggested that you start moving, because broken bones tend to have, obviously there's this period of time where you have to just stay off it and allow it to heal. But when you get to a certain stage in that healing process, you have to start moving again. If you just stay laying down, the osteocytes will not know that they need to start producing more and more and more to support a higher activity level. So how hard someone works will absolutely impact the overall morphology of their skeleton. Those that tend to be very active tend to have more robust bone morphology. They tend to have more robust areas for muscle attachments. Studies of the strength of bones in different populations illustrate the response to changing workloads. So if you're looking at hunter-gatherers versus agriculturalists, the hunter-gatherers are going to have thicker, more robust bone morphology because they're more active. So this is just looking at cross sections between hunter-gatherers and agriculturalists. Osteoarthritis is also something that became more prominent over the last 10,000 years. As humans, of course, are living more sedentary lives, as they're also living longer, essentially. The spinal column over time will degrade. Lumbar back pain is still one of the #1 reasons why humans need to visit a doctor, a general practitioner. So the cartilage in between the vertebrae tends to break down. And these, these growths that you see on the vertebrae here, that's osteoarthritis. So this is something that is more common in humans that have been around the last 10,000 years. Infectious diseases have also changed and increased over the last 10,000 years. Disease is a density-dependent factor. So the closer you are to other humans, the more likely you are for those diseases to spread. So for several factors, increasing population size, of course, is one of them. As population size increased, we began to live in sedentary villages. We began to stay in one place year round. We began to have differences between the haves and the have-nots. We had to all of a sudden figure out what to do with not only human waste, but animal waste. So the last 10,000 years created some new reservoirs for diseases to emerge. So infectious diseases have been on the uptick over the last 10,000 years. And unfortunately, that will probably only increase as population sizes continue to increase. As we all learned firsthand with the COVID pandemic, one of the only ways that we could combat it and fight against it is just simply stay in our homes and to avoid interacting with other people as much as possible, because disease is a density dependent factor. So, it's just definitely something to keep in mind. Because sometimes when I get to this part of the course and we talk about global climate change, sometimes students have a difficult time understanding how this might impact their lives. But absolutely, this is something that will impact all of us if we don't do something about it. If we don't realize that unchecked population growth is not sustainable for so many reasons. But this chapter is definitely something that's relevant to your life. We know that bones can reveal the presence of infections because infections oftentimes leave their mark on the bones. So this is trepidatosis and tuberculosis. So you can see increased incidence of things like this over the last 10,000 years. So the trepidatosis, these lesions on the crania, indicate that this individual from the prehistoric southeastern United States suffered from trepidatosis. The undulating surface of the skull shows active and healed lesions that are caused by the disease's long, slow progression. So some infections are so severe that they actually do leave their mark on the bone. So this is the frontal bone here. So on the skull, this is the frontal, and then the top sides of the parietal, the one all the way back is the occipital. So what you're seeing here is this undulating surface, these, kind of pot marks on the crania. So, that's just an example. There's, of course, more examples of infectious diseases, but that one is one that will definitely leave its mark on the bone. Also, nutritional consequences. We touched on this a little bit last lecture, but as we transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, our diet became less varied, essentially. So hunter-gatherers are eating a combination of vegetation, fruits, insects, tubers, some degree of meat. They're eating all kinds of stuff. But as we transition to agriculture, especially in the beginning, before we kind of realize, we got to vary our diet a little bit, we focus really heavy on carbohydrates, which essentially break down into sugars. So, as we're eating a whole lot of carbohydrates and not necessarily realizing that we have to vary our diets and clean our teeth more frequently, we see a huge incidence, a huge uptick in something called dental caries. So dental caries are just the fancy way of saying cavities. So, cavities that we see, the most common places that we see them are in the teeth and the back of the mouth, because that's obviously the ones that we utilize the most to chew our food. So the premolars and the molars are going to be most impacted. And the common places where you see them are where the teeth, where they bump up against the tooth right next to them. And then also in the center of the molar here as well. Okay. So abnormal development as well. So lack of essential nutrients leads to an overall smaller body size and developmental abnormalities. So the nutrition that we receive, especially during the prenatal and postnatal, can impact our overall adult stature and our health as adults. So that's why they always say, there's even an ad campaign a while back about the first 5 years of life are so critical to our health as adults, even because humans that go through nutritional deficiencies during that time frame sometimes end up with health issues later on. So the stature, the overall height of early agriculturalists actually declined. So we can see that there's all of these skeletal pieces of evidence that the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture wasn't necessarily a good choice, at least early on, because we see all of these examples of nutritional decline in stature, dental caries, evidence of disease, which of course we figured out. Yeah, we got to eat a more varied diet. We have to be more careful about infectious diseases. We figured it out. But at least early on, the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture wasn't necessarily a positive one for humans. Dental cavities or caries. Cavities are more common among individuals with carbohydrate-rich diets. As a result of the digestion of carbohydrates, these carious lesions form as the teeth enamel deteriorates. In extreme cases, the teeth pulp can be affected. So that's essentially the gums. So, obviously in modern day dentistry, when we get, if we get a cavity or an infection in our tooth, we can go to the dentist, or hopefully we can if we have dental insurance. But you guys know what I mean. It's like we have ways of combating this. We have antibiotics if it's severe enough. We have antibiotics. We have ways to fill cavities. But if you're talking about 10,000 years ago, if a human got a cavity and it was severe enough, that could actually lead to death, because if that infection got so severe that it affected the gums and then worked its way into the jaw, that's absolutely something that could eventually lead to death if it's not treated properly. All right, that's just that picture again that's showing you the common location of cavities. So the occlusal or chewing surface, that's a common area here, and then also where they butt up against another tooth right there. So those areas where our dentist always tells us we need to floss, right? Which I'm bad about sometimes myself. All right, so another area of the teeth that we can look at is enamel hypoplasias. So it's these little, it's probably difficult to see, but it's these little lines here in the tooth enamel. So these defects reflect stress episodes that occurred during tooth development. Individuals with multiple hypoplasias on each tooth underwent several stress episodes. So it's almost like rings on a tree that are indicating these stress episodes that this adolescent went through here. All right, some other pieces of evidence: iron deficiencies. So iron deficiency, this is the top of the skull here. So you're looking at a skull from the superior view or a view from above. So iron deficiencies reflect something called parodic hyperostosis and criboorbitalia. Let me show you some better pictures of that here. So this is parodic hyperostosis. So again, you're looking at the skull from a view from above. So here's the frontal bone, and then here's the parietals, here's the occipital. So you see all these pop marks and this porosity. So that's evidence that this individual went through a severe period of iron deficiency. So severe, in fact, that it left its impact on the skull. So essentially, parodic hyperostosis is generally the result of either iron deficient diet, parasitic infection, or genetic disease. But we see a huge uptick of this, both parodic hyperostosis and criboorbitalia, right around the onset of that transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. That few thousand years went during the transition, because it's very likely that iron deficiency became a prominent problem. Because if we're just eating carbohydrates, or at least heavily focused on carbohydrates, we're not getting all the nutrients that we need. And again, this is before we realize, we need to get more variation in our diet to survive properly. And then criboorbitalia, so it's in a different location, but it's essentially due to the same thing. So it's a porosity in the eye orbits due to anemia caused either by iron deficient diet, parasitic infection, or genetic disease. But again, we see an uptick of this particular scenario in the skeletons that we see dating to right around this transition. So it's very, very possible that really iron deficient diet was the primary cause of parodic hyperostosis and criboorbitalia, at least in this time frame. All right, so we've gone through a lot of pros and cons. The last part of that lecture was a lot of the cons, a lot of the negatives. So why did we make this transition then? So this slide always reminds me of, why did we transition from arboreal quadrupeds to terrestrial bipeds? Why did we transition from hunting and gathering to sedentary agriculture? So even though the impacts of this were certainly varied, we know that agricultural practices increased human fertility. So lower energetic demands on females, reduced birth intervals. So remember, birth interval is just simply the period of time between birth A, B, C, D, so on and so forth. So when we're hunting and gathering and traveling 7-8 miles a day just to gather enough food for survival, it's not beneficial for us to stack our birds. It's not beneficial for us to have a baby every year or every 2 years or possibly even every 3 years. When we're hunting and gathering, it's far more beneficial to have a birth every 4 to 5 years, because we really want to be able to invest a great deal in a few offspring. And we don't want to carry around an infant, a 2-year-old, and then have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, trotting behind us while we're trying to travel 7 or 8 miles a day to gather food. It's much more beneficial when we're hunting and gathering to space out those births. But that transition from hunting and gathering to sedentary agriculture allowed females to reduce that birth spacing. We're still not having a birth every year, but reduced it from 5 to 6 years to more like 2 to 3 years in between births. So overall, that led to a population explosion and increased fertility. So obviously in the beginning, that wasn't a problem. In the beginning, that was, in evolutionary terms, a very positive thing for early agriculturalists. They were able to increase their fertility. They were able to increase their reproductive success, which is evolution. That's evolution, my friends. So in the very beginning, it was a beneficial thing. Now, we can certainly argue, 10,000 years later, with a population size quickly approaching 8.5 billion, that increase in fertility wasn't necessarily what we needed. And then, of course, along with a larger population size, we have more people, so we need more calories per land unit and more food resources to support the population size. So even though a lot of these consequences were negative ones, and could definitely argue that it wasn't the perfect choice for humans, it was definitely one that became a necessity if we wanted to support a larger population size. So I'm gonna have you guys watch a little bit of Guns, Germs, and Steel. This is a documentary. It's based upon Jared Diamond's book. And he came up with a hypothesis. He felt that the origins of inequality could actually be linked to geography, essentially. That certain regions of the old world were essentially more plentiful, that they had more nutritious soil, that they had animals that were more easily domesticated. So essentially, we're talking the Fertile Crescent. We're talking that region of the world called the Fertile Crescent that essentially made it easier for some of these early agriculturalists to survive. So it's looking at this hypothesis of whether or not geography can explain origins of inequality. Now, of course, he's, obviously in modern day, there's many other reasons. So I think it's important to remember he's talking about the origins of inequality. So he's going back, 10, 11,000 years here. He's not necessarily talking about inequality in modern day. He's talking more about inequality as we transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. So we're just going to watch about 10 minutes of it, but if it interests you, there is an extra credit discussion this week on this particular documentary. So if this intrigues you, if this 10 minutes intrigues you and catches your attention, this may be a great way for you to earn some extra credit, because we are in our final week, ladies and gentlemen. So if your grade is not exactly where you'd like it to be, please make sure you're doing some of those extra credit options to bring it up, okay? All right, any questions before we watch a little bit of this? Nothing? Okay, all right, let's go ahead and start this.
Another reason for the division of the world into haves and halves.
Oh, hold on, let me check on the volume real quick. There we go. Oh yeah, let's turn that up a little bit.
Have-nots. By 9,000 years ago, the first settlements in the Middle East were giving way to much larger villages. People were only able to live on this scale by becoming more productive farmers. They were surrounded by fields of domesticated wheat and barley. But by now, they also had another steady source of food.
What we see happening about 9,000 years ago is a remarkable transformation in the way that humans are interacting with animals. We begin to see a process of animal domestication, by which we mean humans were controlling where they were moving, they were controlling their feeding, and they were controlling their breeding. Instead of having to go out to hunt, you have a dependable meat supply on the hoof year-round around your site, rather than being subject to seasonal variations in wild game.
As well as meat, animals could be used for their milk, providing an ongoing source of protein. Their hair and skins could be used to make clothes for extra warmth. Over time, domestic animals became an integral part of the new agricultural way of life.
We know that the communities which first started to have domestic animals already had cereal crops, so they were cultivators. And the combination of these particular animals and the plants becomes an extremely attractive package in that they're complementary. After the harvest period, animals could be turned out on the stubble and they can actually eat the remains of the cereal crop harvest. In their turn, animal dung can be used to provide sort of a fertilizer for the cereal crops as well, for crops. So the whole package, is seen to be mutually beneficial, both for the animals and the plants, and of course for the humans.
Goats and sheep were the first animals to be domesticated in the ancient world, and were eventually followed by the other big farm animals of today. All of them were used at first for their meat, but they all proved useful in other ways, especially with the invention of the plow. Before the Industrial Revolution, beasts of burden were the most powerful machines on the planet. A horse or an ox harnessed to a plow could transform the productivity of the land, allowing farmers to grow more food and feed more people. In New Guinea and many other parts of the world, people never used plows because they never had the animals to pull them.
The only big domestic animal in New Guinea was the pig, and wasn't even native. It came in from Asia a few thousand years ago. While Europe and Asia had not only pigs, but also cows, sheep, goats, horses, buffalo, camels, and so on. Now, pigs do give you meat, but pigs don't give you the other products that you get from those European nation animals. Pigs don't give you milk or wool or leather or hides. And most important of all, pigs can't be used for muscle power. Pigs don't pull plows or pull cars. The only muscle power in New Guinea was human muscle power. Even today, there are no beasts of burden in New Guinea, and almost all of the farm work is still done by hand. But if farm animals were so useful, why didn't New Guineans domesticate any of their own? I decided to add up all the animals in the world that have ever been domesticated. And I was amazed by what I found.
There are nearly 2 million known species of wild animals, but the vast majority have never been farmed. Most insects and rodents are of no practical use to humans and not worth the effort of farming. Some birds, fish, and reptiles have been domesticated, but most are simply impractical to farm. So are most carnivores, not because they're dangerous, but because you'd have to grow other animals just to feed them. The best animals to farm are large, plant-eating mammals. And over the years, humans have probably tried to domesticate all of them, usually without success. Despite repeated efforts, Africans have never domesticated the elephant. In South Asia, some elephants are used as work animals, but they're not farmed for the purpose. Instead, each elephant is caught in the wild and then tamed and trained. It doesn't make economic sense to farm an animal that takes some 15 years to mature and reach an age where it can start reproducing.
Animals which make suitable candidates for domestication can start giving birth in their first or second years. They will have 1 or maybe 2 offspring a year, so their productivity is actually high. Behaviorally, they need to be social animals, meaning that the males and the females and the young all live together as a group, and they also have an internal social hierarchy, which means that if humans can control the leader, then they will also gain control over a whole herd or a whole flock.
There's another crucial requirement for a domestic animal. It needs to get along with humans. Some animals don't have the temperament to live on a farm. A zebra could be an ideal domestic animal, potentially as useful as a horse. But evolving in the midst of Africa's great predators, zebras have become flighty, nervous creatures. They have a vicious streak that humans have been unable to tame. That may be why zebras have never been harnessed to a plow or ridden into battle.
I counted up 148 different species of wild, plant-eating, terrestrial mammals that weigh over 100 pounds. But of those 148, the number that have ever been successfully farmed for any length of time is just 14. Goats, sheep, pigs, cows, horses, donkeys, Bactrian camels, Arabian camels, water buffalo, llamas, reindeer, yaks, mithans, and bali cattle. Just 14 large domestic animals in 10,000 years of domestication. And where did the ancestors of these animals come from? None was from New Guinea, or Australia, or sub-Saharan Africa, or the whole continent of North America. South America had the ancestor of just one large domestic animal, the llama. The other 13 were all from Asia, North Africa, and Europe. And of these, the big 4 livestock animals, cows, pigs, sheep, and goats, were native to the Middle East. The very same area that was home to some of the best crops in the world was also home to some of the best animals. Little wonder that this area became known as the Fertile Crescent.
The people of the Fertile Crescent were geographically blessed, with access to some of the best crops and farm animals in the ancient world. It gave them a huge head start. What had begun with the sowing of wheat and the penning of goats was leading towards the first human civilization. The archaeological site of Guer in southern Jordan is 9,000 years old. But it has all the hallmarks of a town. A few hundred people lived here in rows of houses that were a wonder of technology.
Every time I come here, I'm amazed by what those people were doing. Some of the houses have a kind of air conditioning This window here is to control the air coming from the street inside the house, and the houses, the walls and the floors of the houses from the inside at least were covered with plaster. So people were moving to a concept of homes. It's not a place just to sleep. It is a proper home, and people started to decorate the houses from the inside. And people were started to invest in their homes, because if we are talking about plaster, it is time consuming, it's effort consuming, it's very expensive to have plastered house.
As villages grew bigger, there were more people to work on the land. More people could produce more food more efficiently, enough to support specialists within the community. Freed from the burden of farming, some people were able to develop new skills and new technologies. Making plaster from limestone was a major technological breakthrough. The stones had to be heated for days at a time, at a temperature of 1,000 degrees. It may seem insignificant today, but understanding how to work with fire was the first step towards forging steel, a technology that would transform the world. By contrast, places like New Guinea never developed advanced technology. Even today, some people in the highlands are working.
All right, we're going to go ahead and pause there. Again, if this is something that interests you, there is an extra credit discussion this week on the Guns, Germs, and Steel documentary, if that's something that interests you.